is there a way to connect one of these XLR style microphones directly into my camera? So that way you don't have to record things completely separately and then try to sync it all up in post. Well, the good news is, yes, there are a few ways to hook up your XLR microphone to your camera. The bad news is some of the ways to do it are pretty cheap and pretty crappy, and some other ways are good, but way too expensive. And that's where I come in, because today I think I may have found just the thing that's gonna give you pretty decent audio quality right into your camera without breaking the bank. Let's deep dive into the Comica LinkFlex AD2. What's up, my dude? Your friendly neighborhood Tony here, and welcome to the Spare Tech Room, where I try to channel the power of hyperfixation to hopefully help you make better tech choices. Now, before we get into testing this thing out, I want to let you know what some of your options might be in this kind of realm. First off, on the very budget end of things, you can go with something like an XLR to 3.5 millimeter cable. And although that will technically work for some microphones, if you're trying to power something like the Shure SM7B or really any condenser microphone for that matter, you're going to need something that's able to produce a lot more power, and possibly even 48 volt phantom power in the case of a condenser microphone. So with that, the XLR to 3.5 cable is just not going to work. Now, some camera manufacturers do make a separate XLR adapter specifically for this use case. So for example, I have a Sony a7C Mark II that you're looking at me through right now. And Sony makes a device called, I believe it's the K3M, which is similar to this in that it's able to take the XLR microphone and apply phantom power and then ultimately route it into your camera. The problem is that K3M costs around $600. So unless you're doing some high level professional work where you're making a lot of money, I don't think that's worth it, especially when you can get something like this right now on Amazon for about $35. So okay, it's cheap, it's easy, what's the catch? Well, the way I see it, there's probably two catches when it comes to this thing. One is that it doesn't have a built-in rechargeable battery, so you do have to purchase 9-volt batteries in order to operate it. And at the same time, that is a con, but it could also be a pro depending on how you look at it. So a lot of these devices that have built-in rechargeable batteries, eventually those batteries just go bad. And no, I don't mean that the battery just dies, because then of course you just recharge it, but the battery itself will lose its ability to hold a charge over time. And so you spend a ton of money on these devices and eventually they're just useless. Whereas in this case, because you're able to swap out the battery as much as you want, it has the potential to last way longer. Now for me, I went ahead and bought just a couple of rechargeable 9-volt batteries so I can just rotate them out whenever one dies. I'll link to the ones that I picked up in the description box below. Of course, everything that I talk about in this video, including this and any of the accessories, are going to be linked in the description box, so jump on down there if you want to check any of that out. But the only other potential con that I can think of with this device right off the top of my head is that when it comes to using a microphone like the Shure SM7B, that requires a fair bit of juice to get it up to the right volume. And we'll test it out on here. I'll try to run it directly into this to see how much power I can get out of it, how much volume I can produce. But a lot of times in those cases, what you'll need is something called a microphone booster. And that's something that's going to give you a little bit of extra gain, a little bit of volume. So the one that I ended up going with is the Clark Technic CT1. It's really the best bang for your buck mic booster that I could find available today. Sometimes these can get pretty pricey, but this one was somewhere around 30 bucks. So in just a minute, we're going to jump to testing this thing and see if we're able to hook up the SM7B right to it, or if we need a little bit of extra boost. I should also mention that right now, what you're hearing me through is just a little lavalier microphone that I have hooked up directly to my camera. So you can kind of use this as a baseline to see what kind of audio you're getting with all the different setups. I'll also mention that the room that I'm in right now is just a typical spare bedroom. I do have hardwood floors, unfortunately, and although I do also have a bed behind the camera and a few other things up, there is definitely going to be an echo throughout the room. So hopefully this is typical of what you might have available to you. I'm not in some high-level, decked-out studio space. So okay, what we're going to do here now is I'm going to test out my Shure SM7B, the dynamic microphone, and my Oktava MK012, a condenser microphone. I'll do one round of testing where I have them hooked up both to my computer through my audio interface. That should kind of give you the best possible audio out of both of these microphones. Then I will run them both through the Comica, so that way you can see if there's any difference between going directly into an audio interface or going through something like this. I'll also mention that I won't be doing any equalization or compression or anything like that. So this is going to be raw audio all the way through. The only thing I'll do is make sure that the volume is about the same. So pay attention to the quality of the sound, but also pay attention to any background noise or any preamp noise or fuzziness or anything like that. Okay, so let's jump to the Shure SM7B going right into the computer. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna do here is test out the Shure SM7B. It is hooked up directly into my audio interface and then into my computer. Now again, this is gonna give you generally the best possible audio out of a setup like this. The only big problem, of course, being that you need a separate computer and an audio interface, and it creates a lot more opportunity for things to go wrong. So for me, with this video that you're listening to right now, it took me several times trying over and over again to get everything to work correctly. And if you're like me and you're not doing this for a full-time job, every minute that you have free in order to do this kind of work is incredibly valuable, and you don't want to waste your time trying to troubleshoot a computer or all the different programs that have to work together. But either way, all that being said, this is the Shure SM7B going directly into my audio interface, into my computer. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read you a little excerpt from a great American novel that you might have heard of. And I will read this on every single microphone with every single setup, and then I will play everything back to back at the end of the video, so that way you can hear exactly what they sound like compared to each other. So here we go. Let me know if this sounds familiar to you. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. All right, let's switch over to the Oktava. I will boom that mic right out of the frame, and we'll see what that sounds like by comparison. Okay, and here we are on the Oktava MK012. Again, this is a pencil condenser microphone, so I've got it shotgunned out of the frame. It is just above where I'm sitting and aimed kind of at my chin area, probably 8 inches or so away from my mouth. And again, this is plugged into my audio mixer, into my computer, so this should be giving you the best possible audio for this particular microphone without it being EQ'd or compressed or anything like that. But for now, let's go ahead and read the little excerpt from this here book, and then that way we can compare it all together. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. All right, so now let's switch everything over to the Comica, hook up these mics, and see what it all sounds like. All right, and here we are back again with the SM7B hooked up. This time, it's not going to the computer. Instead, it is going to our AD2. And a couple of things I should tell you here before we get going on this. One is that generally, when you're doing this kind of thing, recording directly into your camera, you want to set your camera's volume, your camera's gain, as low as you possibly can with it still being on. So in the case of this camera, you would want to have it set to level 1. Then you would add in whatever gain you need from your actual recording device. Now, unfortunately, because the SM7B is such a thirsty microphone, I had to turn up my in-camera audio a bit more. I have it right now set to level 7, which still isn't very high. I think this camera goes up to like 25 or something like that. So 7 is a reasonable amount of gain to be feeding in from the camera. Now, I have the Comica here set to 75%, which is also, I think, pretty reasonable. Normally, you don't want to max these out. You don't want to have anything set to 100% because that's going to introduce a lot of noise. So, the camera set to level 7, the Comica about 75%. Let's go ahead and read our little excerpt here, and then what we'll do is we'll put the Clark Technic booster in the mix to see what that does for our levels. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. All right, so let's go ahead and get that booster in the mix and see what it does for us. All right, and here we are. We've got the SM7B yet again. This time, I went ahead and hooked up the Clark Technic booster in the mix. I was able to turn the camera audio all the way down to level 1, and I've got the Clark Technic booster currently set just above on, so it's not even at 25% now. It is just barely turned on, and that seems to be giving me pretty good levels looking at the monitor here. So let's see if that makes any difference in the actual recording. The good thing about using a booster like this is that it's going to eliminate any need for you to amplify the volume in either the camera or in something like the Comica AD2. So that's going to eliminate any additional noise that you might pick up. But let's see what it sounds like here with just this in line. And let's go ahead and read our little bit. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. Okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and hook back up the Oktava MK012, the condenser microphone, and we will run that into the Comica AD2 to see what that sounds like. All right, and here we are yet again. This time we've got the Oktava MK012 running right into the Comica AD2. We've got the on-camera audio set to level 1 yet again, so just turned on. And we've got the Comica AD2 set to, here, I'll show you where that is on here. It is just barely on. If you can look at the dial here, you can see we're just getting some audio to come through. Of course, 48 volt phantom power is on. You have to make sure that's on if you're using a condenser microphone like this, as well as if you're using an inline booster like we were using the last time. So whenever you have either of those in place, make sure you have 48 volts phantom power on. The only time you don't really need it on is when you're just going straight into a dynamic microphone with no booster. So okay, let's go ahead and read our little bit here and see what that sounds like on the Oktava MK012, going directly into the Comica AD2, and see if there's any difference between that and running it into the computer. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. So there we have it. Let's go ahead and run all of these back to back so you can see what it all sounds like, and then we will cut back to, I guess, the lav mic to wrap this whole thing up. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part may be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. All right, and there you have it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Were there any major differences in the sound for you? Of course, again, if you want to pick up anything that I mentioned in this video, it will all be linked in the description box. If you use those links, it does help out the channel, but of course, it doesn't cost you anything extra. So if you do that, I appreciate it. If you have any questions about any of the different setup options that I have going on here, let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to try to answer anything that you throw at me. Otherwise, I'll see you next time in the spare tech room. Be good.